What a pleasure it is to have each of you with us for our inaugural Active Transportation Program Symposium. How many of you are from Southern California? Stand up. Follow your hand. Stand right up. Stand up. If you're from Southern California, stand up. Okay? How many of you from... All right. How many of you... Stay standing. How many of you are from Central California? Stand up. Woo! Follow those hands right up. Okay, Central Californians don't take direction very well. Did you notice that? Because they are independent thinkers, and that's a good thing. How many of you are from Northern California? Stand up. Oh, wow, stand up. Woo! And I'm having you stand up because I think you are outstanding. So thank you. Stretch, feel good. Please take your seats. My name's Carl Guardino. I am on the California Transportation Commission, and I'm honored to be here today with our amazing California Transportation Commission staff and our partners at Caltrans in putting together today's program. I'd like to thank a few of my colleague commissioners for being here as well. Our chair, Fran Inman, is here. Did she just step out for a moment? Wow. Whenever I speak, Fran steps out. It's uncanny. From San Diego and a former state legislator and appropriations chair, Christine Kehoe. Christine, thanks for your service and all your good work. In addition is our morning keynote speaker who just joined our commission a month ago, and that is Tamika Butler. Tamika, are you in the room? There we are. Wonderful. We look forward to hearing more about you and from you in just a few minutes. And if I may, I'd like to recognize and thank our CTC team who played a lead in this inaugural ATP Symposium. And if you could stand and stay standing, we're going to do the famous, soon-to-be patented one-clap method to show our appreciation, starting with Lori Waters. Stay standing. Anya Allenbacher. Anya? Oh. Great. And from Caltrans, Emily Abrahams. Good. We're gonna work on this whole direction thing throughout our time. That's what we are as cyclists and active transportation people, though. We're rebels. A quick overview. Our goals today are we want to share and gather information because we believe that we are better together, and that is especially true when we want to promote active transportation in all of our communities. We also want to make sure we connect with each other and the state in this setting that's a little bit away from what we're usually doing during a Tuesday and a Wednesday. So I'm going to encourage you to do something hard. I am on a 12-step program of multitasking. I'm going to encourage you to try to not multitask all day today. You're going to notice after every panel, we have a 15-minute break so that you can get to know each other, you can catch up on your email, you can do other things, but let's take this time to celebrate why we are here and take advantage of this opportunity to learn from each other in doing so. In addition to our CTC staff leaders and Caltrans staff leaders, we also want to thank Sacramento State for helping us with the logistics today, and I also think they deserve one good solid clap. Excellent. Logistics. The panels have intentionally been set up for maximum participation today. So you're going to note that the moderator of each panel, who will introduce the panelists briefly, there's more on each panel in your on each panelist in your program and online, but they are going to ask the panelists for limited opening remarks, Q&A, and then engaging you. We think we're going to learn much more from each other in that format. Jeannie Ward-Waller, could you stand? There you are, right there. Jeannie is going to be moderating the first panel after our morning keynote, and I understand you're giving each of your panelists up to 5 minutes for each of their opening remarks. And we're going to help in that regard. Here's how we're going to help. Our colleague at California Transportation Commission staff, Teresa Favla, could you stand? Good. There are a lot of important people in this room today. Teresa is the most important. Why? She's our timekeeper. Teresa is going to keep our panelists on time so that all of us are kept on time. So Teresa's going to help in this way. When a panel has 2 minutes left, they'll get this subtle small sign. And when they have 1 minute left, and 30 seconds, and then this subtle sign of time is up, and then for those who are especially exuberant, they're the cyclists who will run stop signs and things like that. We're going to let them know it is time to let it go. Okay? Teresa, we're going to bring those down to you in just a moment. It is really important that we hear from you, and there is an app for that. And I will probably, from Silicon Valley, pronounce it incorrectly. So my team will help me. Slido? Slido. S-L-I.do. You could have told me that before, Lord. Kidding. While we're being webcast, which is why we're going to ask our speakers to clearly speak into the mics so that those participating from throughout the state and nation can not only hear us but interact. But if you want to weigh in, you can use the Slido app. There are instructions on how to do so on the CTC site as well as in your program today. The funnest announcement of the day, because it's always fun to see if anyone here stands up. But we're going to support you if you do, because we don't want your battery to be dead. But there is a Toyota Prius in the parking lot, license plate 7 GPF 218. It's in the first floor of the garage, and your headlights are on. So you have a choice. You can, go and take care of the situation, or at lunch, we're going to raffle off your car. Sound good? Okay. With that, the only other item I want to mention about audience participation today is we're going to reward good behavior. So Jessica Zank from the city of San Jose, could you stand up, please? Jessica is someone who peddles what she preaches. She rides her bike everywhere in San Jose. She probably rode the 100 miles here too, but I won't ask her to confirm that. And Jessica's going to be on that first panel this morning. But if Jessica were in the audience later and she had a question for a panelist and was brave enough to raise her hand and to stand up, rewarding that bravery, she will get one of our Foundation Race t-shirts cut for both men and women, depending on the shirt. Pretty cool, huh? So if Jessica stood and asked a question, I would do that. And see what a good catcher she is. Now give it back. You haven't earned it. There you go. Good, okay? So we have a bag of shirts. We're going to have a load of fun throughout the day, too.
Who's having a load of fun? You.
We are. Thank you. You get me every time. It is such a pleasure to introduce our morning keynote speaker. I think most of us know, have heard of, or have heard our keynote speaker for our first day. Tamika Butler is a practicing attorney. She is Tool Design's California Planning Director. She heads up all the equity and inclusion efforts, a diverse background in law, in community, in planning and engagement, and she uses her real-life experiences to help communities, organizations, and individuals address inequality, diversity, and injustice in our work environments. She is the former head of the Los Angeles Bicycle Coalition. Will you join me in welcoming the newest member of the California Transportation Commission, Tamika Butler.
Who's in charge of the signs now? Thank you. Good morning. That was weak. Good morning. I need a lot of energy this morning. My flight was canceled late last night. I had to drive to the Burbank airport, which is a lovely airport, but just very far from my house. And also my son didn't sleep at all last night. And so I mainly slept on the couch for a few hours with him. So I need a lot of enthusiasm. So for folks who have heard me speak before, a lot of this is going to be redundant. I'm not going to apologize for that. People often apologize, but what I've been saying to people is you'll hear me speak and you'll hear me say the same things because a lot of things don't change. And so if folks want to hear me talk about different things, then we should start making some changes. But hopefully, my job today has been different at different times, but I think I finally understand that I'm just supposed to prime us for the day. As my colleague Carl said, our hope is that people are really engaged today, and whether or not that's for a T-shirt or just for the warm feeling it brings you in your heart. The goal is really for those of us who are doing this work to understand what matters to all of you and to understand how we can do it better. And if we just talk but never listen, we won't get that information. And so hopefully folks feel excited to participate today as we go through the different discussions. So I'm going to talk about transformative active transportation, but really I'm just going to talk about myself because I really like talking about myself, and that's the easiest thing to do when you're light on sleep. And so I had probably 4 or 5 calls in preparation of this talk, and I'd say after most of them, this is how my face looked, because I wasn't quite sure what we were trying to pull together. And I think part of why I wasn't sure what we were pulling together is because this is the first time. And whenever something is new and happening for the first time, those of us like me who are trained as lawyers, I like to pretend like I'm very easygoing and go with the flow. But I really like people to just tell me what to do and when to be places and how to do it. And this idea that we're going to be doing something new and different was really confusing for me. And so if you're like me and you were thinking about coming to the symposium today and you were like, what is it about? What are we going to talk about? Is this going to be helpful? Where am I going? I know some of you were, so don't look surprised because I got some emails from folks that were like, what is this? So if you had that feeling, definitely, hopefully we can all go on this adventure together. So folks who have heard me speak before know I'm from Nebraska. Being from Nebraska is very, very important to me. I identify as a lot of things. I'm genderqueer, I'm a Black woman, I'm a mom, I'm a lot of things. I'm a stress eater, but my most important identity is probably being from Nebraska. And the motto of Nebraska is the good life, because it is a good life in Nebraska, despite the fact that my mom just texted me and said it's snowing there. So some might argue that it's a better life here. But I really appreciate being from Nebraska because I think it's given me a Midwestern sentiment and mentality and kindness. How many people have been to Nebraska? This is like the most people I've ever seen. I have no idea why. But family, okay, that's a reason. Has anybody gone to Nebraska just for fun? Okay. A few people, great. So what can you do for fun in Nebraska? You can see corn. You can see more corn. And then, as I always say, you can see white people in corn. Nebraska is a very straightforward place. And so, when I was growing up, I knew my parents were from Nebraska. My parents met in high school. They were high school sweethearts in Nebraska. My mom was from a military family and moved from segregated South Carolina. And so a lot of how she and my grandmother raised us was to constantly be thinking about the ways in which people were segregated and kept apart, and the way in which public spaces weren't public spaces for everyone. And they really taught us to always speak up when we thought something was wrong. My dad had 14 brothers and sisters, all in Nebraska. They grew up in the projects in Nebraska. My dad sold drugs in Nebraska in his projects. And he definitely taught me about the need to always hustle and to always be thinking about what could be, even if you've never seen it, right? And so my dad imagined this life where he wouldn't be in Nebraska forever. He wouldn't be in the projects forever. He wouldn't always have to sell drugs, but there could be something else. Even though he never saw anything else, he believed enough in himself that that could be possible. And so I think, again, that's what we're hoping to talk about today. I think that's something that a lot of folks of color have that just comes naturally to us, but we need everyone to have that. We grow up as people of color in a world where there are predetermined outcomes for us. There are stats, there are things that will happen, there are things people believe, where we're supposed to go, where we're not supposed to go. And we have to every day wake up and believe that despite what people are telling us, are showing us about ourselves, through media, through popular culture, that we can do things differently. And I think here in California, as we start talking about the active transportation program, we want to start thinking about what we could do differently. So because I wanted to be different, I decided that I would go to a Jesuit Catholic undergrad. This is my undergrad, Creighton University. And when I say I wanted to be different, it's because you could probably imagine how many black gay kids there were at this Catholic university in Omaha, Nebraska. And because of that, I very quickly decided I had to get out of Omaha. And so when I graduated from college, I said to myself, I'm too black, I'm too gay, I have to get out of here. And so I applied to law schools all over the country. I think I applied to over 50 law schools. When you're black and gay and from Nebraska, you get a lot of free law school applications. And so I applied for all of them, and ultimately made my way out to the Bay Area, the gay Mecca. And I was like, I'm going to be so gay, it's going to be amazing. But I ended up deciding to go to Stanford. And Palo Alto and San Francisco are not the same city, which no one told the girl from the Midwest. And so I ended up in Palo Alto as the only gay woman in my whole class. And often after you graduate, people come out, but I just had my 10-year reunion and I'm still the only gay. And I can't figure out why we didn't do a better job of recruiting. I tried, but I was unsuccessful. And so I think that I went to Stanford and I thought, I'm going to be a lawyer. Because when I was growing up, as I said, I had a lot instilled in me about civil rights and social justice. And I think like many kids of color, first generation students, low-income students, when we're thinking about that work, we're thinking about things like being a lawyer. We're thinking about intervening with the criminal justice system and the systems that have done us dirty for so long. And then after I graduated, I moved to San Francisco. And I moved to San Francisco. By that time, I realized that it was not the gay mecca for black women. I had still only started to discover Oakland, but that's the mecca for gay black women. Just in case anyone needs any tips. But I moved to San Francisco, and I moved to San Francisco with this fellowship I got after graduation. And this fellowship was basically a civil rights lawyer's dream job. You got money to live anywhere you wanted in the world and start any project you wanted. And they just gave you money for 2 years. It was pretty dope, except I think I got paid like $43,000 to live in San Francisco. The law firm who paid for this, my best friend from law school, who was a gay Mexican Mormon, so we found each other. He went to work for the law firm, and he made like $170,000. So was it a dream job? I don't know. Money's not everything, but it's a lot of things in San Francisco. But I started, what my dream job was I worked at this legal aid organization. I wanted to be an employment civil rights lawyer. When I was in law school, my dad got laid off from his job. And I remember having a conversation with him about it because it created a huge hardship for our family. My dad, of all his brothers and sisters, he had joined the military. He had imagined that life he wanted of traveling all over the world. He joined the military. We traveled all over the world. And he was really the most financially successful of his family. And so he was supporting all of his siblings and my grandparents on both sides. And so when he lost his job, a lot of that weight fell on me. And so for both of my summers in law school, I actually worked at law firms where just in a summer I was making more money than anyone else in my family. And so when it came time to graduate, I was really dedicated to doing public interest law, which I had gone to law school to do. And I remember having a conversation with my dad when he was laid off. And it's really hard to be an adult child where you hit that point where you realize you're actually taking care of your parents more than they're taking care of you. And so to have a conversation with my dad and hear him cry and say he felt like he had been laid off because he was just too black and too old. And I was this kid in law school, and he could have asked me any questions. He could have asked me for help. I could have, done something. I could have intervened, but he just didn't want to impose. He just felt like this kind of thing, he had faced discrimination before, he would face it again, and why would anybody help him? And so that really made me commit to being an employment lawyer and focusing specifically on African Americans who had faced employment discrimination. I think in San Francisco, what I quickly learned, even though I was from Nebraska, there were fewer black folks in San Francisco. San Francisco was just pushing black people out of the city and pushing them into really small neighborhoods. One of the neighborhoods that black folks still lived in when I graduated from law school in 2009 was Bayview Hunters Point. How many people have been to Bayview Hunters Point? How many people were in Bayview Hunters Point like 10 years ago before it became like hip, right? So those of you who had been to Bayview Hunters Point before know that it was a pretty isolated community. When I started my clinic, the Muni train was just starting to come online. The T-line was just starting to go out to Bayview. And the folks in Bayview were pissed off. And they were pissed off because no one had talked to them. In their mind, this was their community, and they needed to get to the city core in order to pursue economic opportunities, job opportunities, economic mobility. And instead, it seemed like this was a train line that had been planned for folks who wanted to see the 49ers. It didn't really seem like it was for them. It wasn't planned with them. It wasn't planned by talking to them, by asking them what times made sense, what stops made sense. It really seemed to revolve around the San Francisco 49ers. And I think for many of us who come from low-income communities and communities of color, we understand that process of being planned for, or more likely planned against, instead of being planned with. And so here I was, some eager beaver young attorney, and all I wanted to do was help people with employment discrimination. And I had two barriers. One, no one believed I was a lawyer. I was this like young black kid, and all these black people would like come to clinics and be like, "Where's the white guy? I want to talk to that guy." And so I first had to like convince people that I was a lawyer. And then after I convinced people that I was a lawyer, the issue was that no one wanted to talk about what had happened at their job unless they knew where I stood on the Muni line. They wanted to know where I stood on this very important issue to their community. Because if I didn't understand what they were saying about why this new line was problematic, then they didn't really want to talk to me and open up to me about the other issues they faced in their life. And so already, fresh out of law school as a lawyer, I had been exposed to the way that transportation is an integral part of everyone's life. I think sometimes as folks who are in the transportation industry, we like to think of our work as like the singular piece of people's lives. But for people who are actually using the things that we do, that we pay for, that we design, that we build, it's just the thing that brings all of those different pieces of life together. My homie Rio is here and is going to speak later, and Rio talks a lot about how transportation is tied to so many other social justice movements. It's really that link that binds them together, and I learned that firsthand as a lawyer. And so as I struggled through being a lawyer, I quickly realized that I hated it. I really appreciate the kind words, Carl, but I am not a practicing lawyer. I am a recovering lawyer. And the person who makes that really possible is my wife. And so this is my wife, Kelly. And I was in San Francisco just toiling away at being a lawyer. I had been doing a lot of employment discrimination in the African American community. My practice had expanded to focusing on LGBT issues and gender issues, and then also running our organization's domestic violence program. And it was just a lot. It was a lot of secondary trauma. It was a lot of triggering, and I needed a fresh start. I also just, like I said, hated being a lawyer. It just wasn't for me. It's a lot of reading and writing. And it turns out that, you know, one of my heroes growing up was Matlock. And that always surprises people, like the young queer black woman is in love with Matlock. But I love that dude. And the reason I loved Matlock is because he was just so authentically himself. He was just so comfortable in who he was. He was just gonna wear the same suit every day. He didn't care. Like, he was Matlock. He was amazing, right? And so as I was looking at my role model in Matlock, I was like, what would Matlock do? He would probably keep practicing law, but he would also be authentically himself. And when I realized that being authentically myself meant I didn't want to be a lawyer, it was a really scary thing. When you are a first generation person getting a law degree, when you are from a low income family, and everyone's really depending on you, and everyone is really so proud of you, and so much of your success is invested in what other people have told you you do for them, it's really hard to leave something like law behind. And so I did the only thing that made sense. I found a girl who was dumb enough to like love me, and I moved to LA because, and it was dumb to move to LA because LA is tough, man. I'm sorry, SoCal people, but it was tough to leave my spot in Oakland and go to LA. But I knew that it would be hard for people in my life to understand that I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore, but it would be really easy for them to understand that I had fallen in love. I'm a Cancer. I'm full of emotions. I'm full of feelings, and people in my life are like, oh, of course, you fell in love, and Kelly's great. She is a lawyer, and our life is much better with only one practicing lawyer. Our fights are still pretty epic, though. I will say, once I moved to LA, I gave you a little teaser of this. I hated it. I had been living in the Bay Area for the previous 6 years. When I was a law student at Stanford, some people might know, is a platinum university. Bicycle campus. And so when I was at Stanford, I naturally did not bike at all. I skateboarded everywhere. I was an avid skateboarder, so I skateboarded and walked everywhere. When I moved to San Francisco and then Oakland, I walked everywhere. I was just constantly active and constantly out of my car. I had a car that sat in a garage and was really to like help friends move or like, you know, go to like far away places to go on hikes where you would still be outside. And then I moved to LA, and this was the scene all the time, just all the time. And I remember I used to call my wife. My first job in LA was the statewide director of this health organization. And I was the first employee outside of Washington, D.C. So I was supposed to make sure everybody in California knew our name, and specifically LA, because that's where we got our first funding. And I would always call my wife in a panic, and I'd be like, I'm running 30 minutes late for my meeting. She's like, well, where's your meeting? And I'd be like, Santa Monica. She's like, wasn't your last meeting in Long Beach? And I'm like, yes. She's like, why did you schedule those meetings back to back? And I'm like, because Google said they were only a few miles away. And she was unsympathetic. But for anybody who's moved to LA, you understand how hard it is. I was from the Midwest where we drive everywhere. Like, I was like, I love driving. This is gonna be great. And then I got to LA and I was like, what in the actual fuck is this? Like, how is there traffic all the time? I drove from South Central to Burbank this morning and I was stuck in traffic at 5 in the morning. It just like makes no sense to me, and I hated it. And I couldn't figure out what I was going to do to like this place, because I had fallen in love with this woman and I wanted to marry her. And she refuses to leave LA because she's one of those weird people, and all LA people know those people. They get to LA and there's like no place better. It's like the best place in the world. Like, nothing's wrong with it. Like, it's perfect. And despite the fact that they think it's perfect and nothing's wrong with it, they still tell you things like, you just need to live here for like 4 years and then you'll love it. And I'm just like, who wants to live anywhere for 4 years before you love it? But I did it. And that's not what made me love LA. What made me love LA is that I had a doctor. I went into the doctor. And I first had to convince the doctor that I wasn't on public assistance, because they didn't take public assistance. But when she saw me walk in, that's what she thought. So after I convinced her that I wasn't on public assistance and that I had insurance, and she saw me, she was really concerned. I had gained a ton of weight and I wasn't as active as I used to be. She told me I was Black, I was a certain age, I fit in the perfect demographics, and I was at risk for diabetes if I didn't get my life together. And so my friend, who had introduced me to my wife, said, you should buy a bike. You should buy a bike and you should train for AIDS life cycle with me. I was like, I'm too fat for a bike. Like, those wheels are very tiny. And that really, like, people on bikes on mountains, like, that seems like white people things. Like, that's not for me. And she was like, no, you should totally do this. And so I did. I bought a bike and I trained with her for AIDS life cycle, and I did AIDS life cycle. And I loved it. And after I got back to LA, I started riding my bike everywhere, because what I realized is that once I got out of my car and once I actually got on my bike, I fell in love with the city, because I was actually slowing down. It wasn't just about where I was going, but it was about the actual journey. I could be in the mountains, I could be at the beach, I could be at my house in like a super suburban part of the city, all in one day, all powered by myself. And for people who aren't from LA, they think it's like a super not bikeable place. I mean, it's not completely safe because the infrastructure isn't there, but I've never felt worried biking in LA. I've just felt happy that I live in a city that is so beautiful and so diverse and has so many different neighborhoods. And so as I fell in love with bikes, and as I started riding my bikes everywhere, this same friend came to me and said, you should work at the Bike Coalition. And I went to the Bike Coalition website, and I looked at all the pictures of all the people, and I was like, yo, this is a lot of white people. And I'm from Nebraska, like, I'm used to a lot of white people, but my wife is white, like, her whole family's white, like, and they're Canadian, and they're super white. And so, like, I can handle white people, but it seemed like a lot. And I had a number of friends who knew I was a civil rights lawyer and kept saying to me, bike lanes are the first signs of gentrification. Like, how are you going to work at this bike coalition? You're going to be a sellout. I really was stuck and I didn't know what to do. But as I stated earlier, I went to a Catholic university, which is an important fact because I'm very motivated by guilt. And so I had a friend who lived in San Francisco who was a woman of color who worked at the public health organization with me. And she called me and she said, you should apply to work at the LA County Bicycle Coalition. I'm like, you're like the second person to tell me this. Like, what is this organization? I didn't even know what a bike coalition was. And she explained to me that the San Francisco Bike Coalition was also hiring an executive director. And they had just made this hire, the superstar from New York, who was a white man. And she was really excited about him being hired, but she had done some research, and the only women of color who led bike coalitions in the whole country would be me if I took this job, and then another woman in Oakland. And her whole thing was that there needed to be more folks of color who weren't from traditional transportation backgrounds who were running active transportation organizations. She told me about how frustrating it was to have the San Francisco Bike Coalition take a ton of money from Google, but then not really talk about what Google buses were doing to the rest of the transportation system in the city, not talk about what Google was doing to affordable housing in the city, not talk about the public health outcomes of different people in the city. And all of these things that were tied to active transportation, but weren't bikey enough, so didn't come up. And so that guilt worked, and I applied for the job, and I got the job. And I was really surprised I got the job. I remember interviewing for the job, and the last question that the chair of the board asked me is there anything else you want us to know? And I said, look, like, I'm a queer Black woman. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I don't know much about bike advocacy, but any job I do, though, that's the framework I'm going to bring to my work. And if that's not okay, then you probably shouldn't hire me. No hard feelings, but you just shouldn't go that way. And this white guy, Steve, who is one of my favorite people and one of my best mentors, looked at me and said, okay. And so I went home and Kelly said, how did it go? And I was like, I don't think your people are ready for me. Like, I don't think I got the job. And so a few days later, Steve called me and enthusiastically offered me the job. And I said, you called Tamika. I think you have the wrong number. And he said, no, we're really excited. And that started, I think, what was my entry into the transportation world. And I was really lucky and I was really fortunate. I had this job where maybe when I started, I thought, this is a hobby I have. This is something that makes me really happy, and I get to do it every day for my job, and I get to pass out a few bike lights. And if I pass out a few fewer bike lights every year, who's gonna care? Like, no one's even gonna pay attention to me at this bike coalition. Most of my friends, outside of the transportation world, had no idea what this job was. They thought I was making it up. My mom was confused. She was like, you've moved to California, you're eating a lot of salad, you're riding your bike, you went on this trip where you camped every night, and now you work at a bike coalition? Like, what am I gonna tell my friends? She was just like, she was so mortified because she couldn't understand what I was doing. And very quickly, I think thanks to the folks at People for Mobility Justice, thanks to Jeannie at Cal Bike when she was there, thanks to Tony at Cal Walks, just a bunch of people who had been in the space much longer than me. I very quickly learned that bikes were just going to be the tool we were using to do so much more important work. That active transportation was this tie to so many things I cared about and made me happy, but that really we needed to be talking about how transportation impacts so many different facets of people's lives. And I found a community that really welcomed me and accepted me and allowed me to do that work. I also found a lot of people who hated me. I never understood how high profile a bike coalition job was until I discovered like the bike coalition Facebook like feeds, which are insane. Like, people have a lot of free time. And so I realized that whether or not I was enough of a biker was constantly questioned. Whether or not I actually cared about infrastructure, active transportation, traditionally, all of these things were constantly questioned. And I was there for about 3 years before I decided to ultimately move on, because there was just something about the bicyclist community that wasn't quite ready for where the rest of the world was going. They weren't ready to talk about this thing that we all loved and this thing that all brought us together and how it was tied to so many different issues. Instead, they wanted to just focus on bikes. And this really came to a head in Los Angeles when we had someone who was a bike advocate running for city council, who also just happened to be a racist and a sexist and transphobic, and was caught being all of these things on the dark internet. And after that happened, ultimately, much of the bike community still decided that this was the person they should vote for because he would build them a bike lane, and that all of the other things he had done and said could be ignored. And so that's when I really felt like I needed to take a step back from the active transportation space straight up and really examine where my fit was going to be and what I was going to do. I wasn't going to let people bully me out of a space because I knew that this was the space for me, but I just needed to reset. And when I was thinking about resetting and coming back into the transportation world, I thought about what I liked about the Bike Coalition, and I thought about some of the successes we had had. It was this awesome place. You know, we made Los Angeles a Vision Zero city, and then we fought for Measure M. And Measure M was this local measure in Los Angeles County that was going to give money to our whole transportation system, but for the first time have a specific allocated amount for active transportation. And this was important to us because at the time that we were pursuing this measure, these were the stats in Los Angeles. People were dying every single day, and most of these people were unfortunately low-income folks and folks of color who were biking and walking despite not having as much of the mode share. And these stats have only gotten worse in LA and are similar throughout much of the state. And so when we realized that this was happening, we saw that we wanted at least 10% of the sales tax, right? Like at least 10%. If we knew that we had about 20% of all trips through active transportation, but about 40% of all death, but only 1% of the transportation funding in the county, we knew that the numbers just didn't add up. And again, we knew that that was disproportionately impacting low-income folks and folks of color. We knew that our decision makers were essentially saying, if you are low income, if you are a poor person or you are a person of color, and maybe you're not biking or walking because you've made a choice, maybe you're biking and walking because that's all you have, we don't care if you die. We don't care if you die, and we're not going to give you the resources to do it. And when I thought about, after leaving the Bike Coalition, when I thought about the success, I knew I had to re-engage in transportation, and I knew I had to re-engage on a statewide level, which is why I ultimately went to Tool Design to be our California planning director. When you think about statewide funding, this is what the California Bicycle Coalition says about the ATP program. It's the only significant source of funds dedicated to increasing biking and walking in California, and that it represents approximately 1% of the transportation budget. So again, we were fighting for 10% because we knew 1% wasn't enough, but when you look at the ATP funds, they're just not doing enough. And so as I wrap up, I wanted to just talk about what I think is missing from the ATP, but I also wanted to invite all of you to start having this conversation. If we know, part of why I've talked about myself so much thus far is just to show that for many of us, this work is personal. You're going to see folks up here on panels, you see me up here now, and folks have denoted us as experts. And the reality is, when I really think about who the experts are, they're really folks in the community. Because that's the only thing that makes me worthy of being an expert on anything. I'm trained as a lawyer, I've practiced law, I've done a lot of public health work. I never went to planning school. Like, I worked at a bike coalition, but I got that job without any real qualifications. What makes me an expert, right? And I think we have to start asking ourselves, what is expertise and what does that look like? And what I would offer is that everyone in this room, if you are a person who bikes and walks or has people in your life who bike and walk, then you're an expert in some way because you are able to think about this work on a human level. And I think too often we think about this work very technically. We think about the infrastructure, we think about the timelines, we think about the budgets, we think about all of these things, but we should just be thinking about people. And if you're a person in this room who can think about people, then what we want you to do throughout the rest of the symposium is think about how this active transportation program, in order to be innovative, has to put people at the center and think about people. And sometimes when people think, well, I care about moving freight. Well, that's still about people. The people the people who are getting the things, the people who are driving the things, someone who is driving that truck is a sister or a mom or a brother or a son. All of the things we do that are tied to transportation funding are ultimately going back to people. And they're going back to people who really aren't thinking about it in these technical terms, but they're thinking about it in terms of how it's impacting their lives. Years ago, there was a study about folks who were impacted by AIDS and HIV, who weren't going to the doctor. And they were trying to figure out why. Was it the stigma? Was it that they were just too sick? Were the doctor's offices too far? What was keeping them? And people literally said, I don't have a way to get there. Transportation was the number one reason. When you look at kids who are constantly missing school, oftentimes it's about transportation. And so while we may be thinking about the budget or the scoring on an application, I'm saying we should be thinking about people. That's what's actually missing. I also think what's missing is equity. And I know this is a buzzword that has become super sexy. I was just at a conference last week where one of the questions that was asked was, are we in danger of getting to a place where people just slap an equity label on something to say they've done it, but they don't actually care or know what that means? And my response was, I don't think we're in danger of getting to that place. I think we're already there. And because we're already there, we have to stop and really ask ourselves what this means. One of the speakers at the conference said the trouble with equity was that equity was like blue. And some people were talking about seafoam, some people were talking about light blue, some people were talking about navy, but there was no understanding of what that was. And I think that's part of what's happening with the active transportation program. I don't think, as a rule, that people who do transportation work are bad people. I know I make a lot of jokes about people who bike, but I think fundamentally, if you care about transportation, you're doing it because you care about making things better. You care about connecting people or things. So I think fundamentally you're a good person and you probably want equity, but you don't necessarily always know what that means. And often it becomes a conversation that turns to geographical equality, not equity. It turns into a conversation about, is everybody getting our fair share? And that's not what equity means. Equity means people who have historically had the least get the most. Equity means that people get exactly what they need, not that everybody gets the same thing. And so everyone doesn't need the same kind of bike. So you're going to give people the kinds of bikes they need. And I think in a state that is as vast and diverse as ours, we're really struggling with what this means in the active transportation program. I know many people are struggling with what the definition of disadvantaged communities is, and if disadvantaged communities have too much of an advantage, and should they get less, or should we take that out, this, that, or the other. You know, I'm pretty simple, I'm pretty transparent. I think that the people who have historically had the least should get the most. I think that when it comes to disadvantaged communities, if people are worried that disadvantaged communities are getting too much of the pot, then they should probably think about what the disadvantaged communities have been losing out on for decades, what those communities actually need. I'm sure this will be a debate, I'm sure it will be a conversation, but I'm never going to be moved from believing that we have a society that is built on racism. We just live in a racist country. It's just what it is. If you don't think this country is racist, you might also think the world is flat. And I don't have anything else to say to you after that because I don't know where we go. And there are certain parts in the state, and it's not all about race. Most of the times it is. Sometimes it's about income. Sometimes it's about isolation, where the resources just haven't been given. And so those communities might have to get more because we're still just trying to catch up. Until I came to the transportation world, I never heard the term mitigation as much as I hear it now. We're just constantly trying to mitigate. But shouldn't we be trying to get ahead of things? Shouldn't we be trying to acknowledge what's happened in the past and actually do better? And rather than retrofitting equity, shouldn't we just be building it in from the beginning? Because all of us who care a lot about budgets have to start realizing that when you retrofit things, it costs more in the end. And so for me, we still haven't figured out what equity means. And that's just not about disadvantaged communities. It's about how do low-income folks of color who are actually in the communities who are going to benefit from this work, who we need to make this stuff work, how do they get paid for their expertise? How do community-based organizations participate? I was part of an ATP application when I was at the Bicycle Coalition in Cycle 2. We won an ATP grant with LAUSD. It was written in collaboration with LAUSD and the Bike Coalition, but the Bike Coalition did a ton of work. I did a lot of long nights on that application. The work hasn't started yet. The work hasn't started yet because it's not an infrastructure project. And so for me, part of what's missing from the ATP process is just a general understanding. People apply for these grants and we have these workshops like, how do you apply and how do you write a successful grant? And then those of us that get the money are like, but how does this work? And then often we go to the professionals in the agencies who are supposed to help us and they're not sure either. It's really hit or miss if you can find someone who actually knows how to get it through the system. And so I hear this project we won, which is a train the trainer model to teach PE teachers how to train their students how to ride bikes, to start getting people in that pipeline of active transportation. The work is going to start. I hear it's going to start probably next year. But why has it taken so long? Who are the kids that missed out? How is it that one or two people can sit on something and completely slow it down or stop it? What are we doing to make sure that once people actually win, that they actually can use the money and do something? They actually can understand the systems and the forms and the invoicing and all of those things. That also ties back to equity. When you make something so complicated that even the professionals, again, we partnered with LAUSD, a huge organization. When they, with all of their resources and money, are still struggling to figure out how to get invoices done, how do you think that factors into making sure that the people most directly impacted by the stuff we're saying we're doing are able to access the program? They can't. And then the last thing I think is missing from the ATP program, I mean, I could go on, but since I was already running late, I cut it short. The last thing I think is missing is intersectionality. And intersectionality is another one of those buzz terms that everyone doesn't know what it means. But intersectionality simply means we're thinking about all of the overlapping issues. So as I said, I hated being a lawyer. I was a very lazy lawyer. And so when somebody came into my office and they were a white gay man and they said, I've been discriminated against because I'm gay, I'm like, yes, I will take your case. Because that's a super straightforward case. This person was not in any other protected classes except being gay. So when I asked them why they were discriminated, because I'm gay. When I asked them for examples, gay, super easy. When I had undocumented women of color come in and say, why were you discriminated against at work? They'd be like, oh man, I don't know. There's so many things it could be. It could be this, it could be this, it could be the overlap of this, and then I got pregnant, it could be that. And there were just so many issues. As a lawyer, that was a very complicated case because I had to be able to see the overlaps. And the reality is, some of us live in multiple identities every day. So when somebody is crossing the street when they see me coming, I don't know if they're doing it because I'm black. I don't know if they're doing it because I'm young and black. I don't know if they're doing it because they think I'm a young black man. I don't know if they're doing it because they know I'm a black woman, but they're confused by my gender representation, and so they're just crossing the street to avoid me anyway. Like, I don't know, but I categorize and think about all of those things in quick succession in my head. And we have to be able to live in a world where everyone does that. Some of us don't have the privilege where we are able to think about the world in any other way. Some of us think about equity and race and all that we do because there's simply no other way to live our life. If we didn't think about it, we could end up dead. And so for those of us who have the privilege, who get to check out and not think about every single intersection, how do you do that work? When I'm training folks at Tool Design, I always say to them, if we have a client who said, this intersection is a disaster and people keep dying, and we went out to the intersection and we said, oh man, we gotta change the lane width, we gotta extend the curb, we gotta mess with the signal timing, we really gotta change the configuration of this cross. This seems complicated. Let's go mid-block and put in a parklet and tell the client that we fixed the fatality problem. No one would hire us. Everyone knows that would be a bad idea. But when it comes to transportation funding, and when it comes to these applications, when it comes to thinking about projects, we don't like that messiness. We don't like the messiness of people telling us and thinking about projects that can tackle public health and tackle the environment and tackle affordable housing. We just want to focus on transportation. But as Audre Lorde once said, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't lead single issue lives. Sometimes as transportation people, we just want to lead those single issue lives because it's easier that way. And especially when we think about all the complications that I just talked about with even understanding the ATP process. You don't want to make it more difficult. But if we don't tackle intersectionality with the issues facing our state, then we're not going to get the best projects, and we're not going to get the best work, and we're not going to get innovation. Ultimately, the bottom line that was given to me was talk about how we can make this ATP thing innovative. And right now, I think we're in a place where we're trying. We care. I don't want to say throw the program out because the program is trying to do great work. But what we need all of you to do today is put on your thinking caps and think about how we're in a state that is so wealthy, that is so bountiful, that is the headquarters where Carl's from, of Silicon Valley, of the best ideas, some of the worst ideas, but also just lots of ideas. How can we not push ourselves to think, like my dad so many years ago, not just of the life that we've known, not just of the active transportation program that we've already experienced, but how can you force yourself to believe that it could be more innovative, that it could be better, that it could get more and more people biking and walking, that it could tackle some of our climate change problems, that it could tackle some of our housing and affordability problems. How can you force yourself to be that kid who was selling drugs on the corner with his gun, hoping no one jumped him, and now being the guy who has this daughter who's speaking on stage, who he's so proud of? He doesn't even know what the California Transportation Commission is, but if you ask him, it's all he talks about. And so for me, I don't want to let my dad down. I don't want to be stuck by what we've been. I don't want to be stuck by what other people have determined we should be. I want to be able to imagine something that is different and make that a reality. The first step in doing that is this symposium today and having all of you actively participate and helping us imagine something different. Thank you.
Oh, sure, now the Central Valley people know how to stand. Well done, Central Valley people. What an honor and a pleasure that was. I'm going to do this in a lightning round format so that we can still take a few moments to stretch our legs, just as Tamika, I believe, has stretched our minds and our hearts with her presentation this morning. So I'd like 3 people to stand, and in one sentence, run-ons not allowed. What was your main takeaway from what Tamika shared? Any 3 people? And yes, yeah, you want a shirt, I can tell. Please, and if you could provide Tamika with your name, where you're from. Can we get John Ciccarelli a microphone so that the millions of people watching on webcast, including Tamika's dad, can hear?
It was something Tamika said at the beginning and the end. I'm not sure I got the words precise, but it's always be thinking about what could be, even if you've never seen it.
John Ciccarelli, thank you. Stay standing because this shirt's coming at you and I'm not that good of a name. Who's next? Who's next? Main takeaway, please. And if you could share again your name and where you're from.
Oh, sure. Mary Jo Gallenbeck. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina, so I'm really thrilled to be here. Yeah, my main takeaway is the value of interdiscipline partnerships to tackle active transportation for also the environment, affordability, as also mode of transportation.
Excellent, thank you. And third, stand please. If I fall off the stage, who's catching me? Notice that no one said they'd catch me. Thanks. And in the very back, name please.
I'm Patricia Chen from LA Metro, and my takeaway is that if you are intimately connected with active transportation on a human-centered basis, you are an expert.
Great observation. You're going to have to meet me halfway because I'm not throwing that far. Will you once again join me in thanking Tamika? At 10:30, not 10:31, we'll be welcoming Jenny Ward-Waller and her panel to the stage. Please join us, and thank you.